Gerald Eugene Stano didn't stand out. He didn't wear a scowl or Project Menace. To most people, he appeared forgettable, just another face in the crowd. That anonymity worked in his favor for years. As police departments across states searched frantically for missing girls, they never suspected that the shy, unassuming man drifting from town to town might be the architect of their worst nightmares. Beneath his quiet demeanor lurked a pathological predator. Born in 1951 as Paul Z. in Schenectady, New York, Gerald's early life was defined by rejection and instability. His biological mother abandoned him shortly after birth. Malnourished and neglected, he was placed in foster care and then adopted by Eugene and Norma Stano, a middle-class couple who renamed him Gerald. Though the Stanos provided him with structure and support, Gerald's psychological foundation was already fractured. His early development had been stunted. He was withdrawn, manipulative, and chronically dishonest from a young age. As a boy, Gerald struggled to fit in. He lied constantly, even when there was no reason to. He boasted about things he hadn't done and took credit for acts he never committed. His school records painted a picture of someone who was academically capable but emotionally unstable. His parents enrolled him in several private schools, hoping the strict discipline would help, but nothing worked. He was expelled repeatedly for disruptive behavior and theft. Even in childhood, there were signs that something was deeply wrong. In his teenage years, Gerald's behavior became more troubling. He began engaging in petty crimes, shoplifting, vandalism, and later, forging checks and stealing money. He showed no remorse, often blaming others for his mistakes. What was most disturbing, though, was how easily he could manipulate those around him. He could turn on the charm when needed and adopt a convincing mask of innocence. Despite these warning signs, Gerald managed to avoid serious consequences. He moved from one job to another, mostly working in low-level clerical roles or maintenance work. No one suspected that the awkward, insecure man who preferred solitude was hiding a far darker reality. The 1970s were a chaotic decade for law enforcement. The growing number of serial crimes across the United States strained resources and created a climate of fear. Gerald took full advantage of this chaos. Between 1973 and 1980, young women began disappearing in Florida, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Many were hitchhikers or runaways, easy targets, rarely missed right away. Police treated these cases as isolated incidents. It would be years before anyone even considered a connection. Gerald had no consistent method, which made detection even harder. Some victims were stabbed, others were strangled. A few were left in wooded areas, others dumped in canals or buried shallowly in fields. There were no calling cards, no taunting letters to the press, no trophies, kept just bodies, vanishing, without trace or explanation. To authorities, they were random, but to Gerald, they were chapters in a story he was writing in secret. What made Gerald particularly dangerous was his understanding of weakness. He targeted women who were vulnerable runaways, sex workers, or young girls walking alone. He knew no one would come looking right away. He also learned to blend in perfectly. He could act concerned when questioned. He could even offer to help search for missing persons, all while knowing exactly where their bodies lay. It wasn't until he was arrested for unrelated crimes in 1980 that police finally caught a glimpse of the true Gerald Stano. At the time, he was being held for writing bad checks and fraud, just more of his usual scams. But during questioning, he did something no one expected. He confessed, unprompted and calm. He told detectives that he had killed a woman years ago. The officers were stunned. They hadn't even asked him about murder. When pressed further, he began to unravel a horrifying tale, one that stretched back nearly a decade and crossed multiple state lines. He named victims, described scenes, and listed burial sites. He was oddly specific, offering details no one had released publicly, and he did it all with a chilling lack of emotion. To the detectives, it was as if Gerald had been waiting to tell the story all along. But why now? Was it guilt? Or was it a perverse need for attention, for recognition as one of the most prolific killers in American history? As the investigation deepened, Gerald's calm exterior began to show cracks. He seemed to enjoy the interviews. He corrected officers when they got details wrong. He even offered commentary on his own behavior, speculating about what had driven him to kill. Law enforcement didn't know what to believe. Was this man a twisted genius, finally revealing his crimes? Or was he a compulsive liar, fabricating murders to insert himself into the annals of infamy. What no one could deny, however, was that Gerald Stano, quiet, awkward, and previously invisible, had now taken center stage in a serial murder case that threatened to expose the deepest failures in the justice system, and this was only the beginning. The confession came out of nowhere. No one in the Valut County Sheriff's Office expected it. Gerald Stano was sitting in an interrogation room in early 1980, answering routine questions about check fraud. It was a quiet session, no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations. He was being held for forging checks and passing bad paper across the Daytona Beach area, yet seemed remarkably relaxed for someone facing jail time. But then, he leaned forward, lowered his voice, and told the detective something that would shift the entire trajectory of the investigation. "I killed a girl," he said. "Her name was Donna." The room went still. The detective, unsure whether this was a joke or some kind of attention-seeking behavior, asked him to clarify. Gerald didn't hesitate. He said he had picked up Donna Foster, a young hitchhiker, several years ago and strangled her to death before dumping her body along a desolate Florida roadside. He gave a specific location. A day later, investigators found skeletal remains in the area, precisely where he said they'd be. This wasn't bluster. Gerald Stano had just confessed to murder and appeared to be telling the truth. At first, detectives thought he might have killed just once. A crime of passion, perhaps, or an accident. But when they asked him whether there were others, his answer chilled the room. Yes, he replied simply. There were a lot more. He began naming them, girls and women from different places, different years. Some of the names matched missing persons cases that had long gone cold. He described victims in disturbing detail, how he approached them, how they begged, how they died. He remembered hairstyles, clothing, even jewelry. Investigators listened in disbelief as he rattled off more than a dozen names, but the way he spoke was almost robotic, devoid of remorse, emotionless, as if he were reading a list. When asked why he did it, Gerald offered no coherent explanation. Sometimes he said the girls deserved it, other times he claimed he couldn't help it. When questioned further, he would often shrug or stare blankly at the wall. There was no pattern to his logic, only chaos. That as the days passed, Gerald kept talking. In a chilling series of interviews that would span months, he confessed to killing over 40 women across multiple states. The scope of his admissions stunned even the most hardened homicide detectives. He named victims from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Florida. Many of the cases were already open files in police departments across those states. Young women who had vanished without a trace, whose families had all but given up hope. Gerald was a confessor, but his confessions came with a dangerous question. How much of what he said was true? Some investigators were skeptical. The details he gave in many cases were astonishingly accurate: locations, victim descriptions, even weather conditions. But others were riddled with inconsistencies. He'd get the year wrong, or the name slightly off. In a few instances, he claimed responsibility for killings that had already been solved and pinned on other perpetrators. This presented a major challenge. Law enforcement now had a man claiming to be one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history, but verifying his claims was a logistical nightmare. Records had been misplaced. Many cases lacked DNA evidence. Witnesses had moved or died. Some families wanted closure and were ready to believe him. Others refused to accept that Gerald Stano had killed their daughters, especially given the discrepancies. One of the most hotly debated aspects of Gerald's confessions was the role played by the detectives themselves. Critics would later argue that investigators eager to solve unsolved cases may have fed him information, intentionally or not. They suggested that Gerald, a compulsive liar and manipulator, may have pieced together the details from press reports and used them to build believable stories. He had spent years absorbing newspaper clippings and was reportedly fascinated by the media coverage of serial killers. Still, there were confessions that no one could explain away. In one interview, Gerald described the precise position of a body found near a canal. He knew the color of the victim's bra. He recalled the victim had a limp in her right legs, something never reported in the press. Those weren't guesses, they were memories. Some law enforcement officers began to view Gerald as a kind of murder tourist, someone who wandered the country and struck opportunistically. He had no singular method, no consistent type. He killed whenever he felt like it, then moved on. And when finally caught, He seemed to savor the attention that came with being the center of such a vast and gruesome narrative. The media seized on the story. The Confessor Killer, they called him. Others dubbed him the Silent Strangler. Headlines screamed about a man responsible for dozens of deaths, a killer who had slipped under the radar for years, masquerading as an average citizen. Reporters descended on Daytona Beach, eager for a glimpse of the man whose face, just weeks earlier, had meant nothing. Meanwhile, Gerald continued to speak. Sometimes, he seemed to get a thrill from the interviews, correcting detectives when they got details wrong. He seemed proud of what he had done, even if he couldn't explain why. But, beneath the surface, cracks began to appear. Was Gerald telling the truth? All of it? Or was he embellishing, even fabricating, to inflate his legacy? As investigators pored over his words, trying to separate fact from fiction, one thing was clear. Whether he had killed 10 women or 40, Gerald Stano was a predator. He had stolen lives, shattered families, and emerged from the shadows not with regret, but with stories. And he was just getting started. By the time Gerald Stano had finished confessing, the number of murders he claimed responsibility for had ballooned to over 40. It was a staggering figure, one that, if proven accurate, would place him among the most prolific serial killers in American history. But law enforcement wasn't celebrating. Instead, they were caught in a mire of confusion, contradiction, and a growing concern. How much of Gerald's story was real? Each confession presented a new challenge. In one interview, Gerald described picking up a hitchhiker outside Tallahassee in 1974. He claimed to have strangled her with a belt and dumped her body in a drainage canal off a rural back road. The location checked out. Police had found a young woman's remains there that same year, an unsolved case that had haunted the local sheriff's office. Gerald described the clothing, the purse she carried, and even her first name. It all matched. That confession seemed airtight. But the next day, he spoke of a girl named Carrie he claimed to have killed in Pennsylvania. His details were vague. He couldn't remember the town, only that it was cold and near train tracks. He said he stabbed her in a motel room and left her in a dumpster behind a gas station. When detectives investigated, they found no missing person or unsolved murder fitting that description. No reports, no evidence, no body. The pattern continued. For every chillingly accurate confession, there was one that felt incomplete, questionable, or entirely fabricated. Some cases were decades old, the physical evidence long gone. Others were newly opened, and Gerald's statements filled in details that detectives had never released to the public, information that shouldn't have been accessible, unless he'd been there. But how could a man who'd been arrested for petty crimes, fraud, theft, and impersonation also be responsible for so many brutal murders? The contradiction disturbed everyone. The picture that emerged was of a deeply manipulative man, one who thrived on deception and who may have used murder as a tool not just for violence, but for control. The media began asking hard questions. Was Gerald Stano a pathological liar, or a criminal genius hiding in plain sight? The debate intensified when several of his alleged victims' families came forward. Some accepted his guilt immediately, desperate for closure. Others were suspicious. They had followed the cases for years and were skeptical that a man with no personal connection to their daughters had carried out such specific and targeted killings. One mother, whose daughter disappeared while hitchhiking through Daytona Beach in 1975, told reporters he said her name like he knew her, like they'd talked, but how could he? She wasn't even supposed to be in Florida. In another case, Gerald claimed to have killed a girl in Georgia at the time. Credit card records placed him in New Jersey. It didn't add up. As these contradictions mounted, defense attorneys seized the opportunity. They argued that Gerald was mentally ill, highly suggestible, and that detectives intentionally or otherwise had coached him during interviews. They claimed the long unrecorded interrogations left room for manipulation. Gerald, they said, had simply told police what they wanted to hear. Some psychologists supported this theory. They pointed to his history of compulsive lying and attention-seeking behavior, characteristics often linked to certain personality disorders. Gerald had a lifelong pattern of inserting himself into stories to gain praise or sympathy. It wasn't impossible that, once he realized his confessions were giving him notoriety, he exaggerated or invented more to keep the spotlight on himself. Yet others weren't convinced. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement ran forensic comparisons between Gerald's statements and autopsy records. In many cases, they found matches too specific to dismiss. Gerald described unique birthmarks, clothing, or methods of restraint that were never made public. He had knowledge that could only have come from the killer or someone intimately involved in the investigation. What made Gerald different from other known serial killers was his complete lack of consistency. Most serial predators follow patterns, specific victim types, methods of killing, or locations. But Gerald's confessions painted a portrait of a chaotic drifter, someone who killed whenever the impulse struck, regardless of the victim's age, race, or background. He claimed to have murdered teenage girls, middle-aged women, hitchhikers, and even a woman he met at a laundromat. Some were strangled, others stabbed, a few drowned. The randomness made it almost impossible for law enforcement to trace him using traditional profiling methods. He left behind no calling cards, no notes, no trophies. He simply moved on, blending back into society like smoke after a fire. Despite mounting criticism, Gerald was eventually charged in multiple murders. Prosecutors chose only the strongest cases, those with physical evidence or airtight confessions. In 1984, he was convicted of the murder of Kathy Lee Schaff, a 17-year-old whose body had been found strangled and dumped in a canal in 1973. That conviction carried the death penalty. More would follow, but many of the cases remained open, unsolved, or too weak to pursue. Still, the specter of Gerald's confessions lingered. Were there really 40 victims? Or was he a clever storyteller, weaving half-truths into a chilling legend? Had law enforcement closed cases too eagerly, desperate for resolution? And how many families had accepted a lie in exchange for closure? What emerged was a web of lies, half-truths, and bodies. Some threads led to justice. Others dangled unanswered, perhaps forever. In the center sat Gerald Stano, a man whose words could either expose decades of horror or conceal a fiction more twisted than the truth. By the mid-1980s, Gerald Stano had become a figure of both horror and confusion within the American justice system. He had confessed to killing over 40 women, and while some of those confessions led to criminal charges and even convictions, others existed in a limbo of uncertainty. Law enforcement, prosecutors, families, and the media were all grappling with the same question. How do you pursue justice when the line between truth and lies is so thoroughly blurred? Stano's most solid conviction came in 1984 for the murder of Kathy Lee Schaff, a 17-year-old whose body was found in 1973 in Port Orange, Florida. She had been strangled and dumped in a canal. The case had gone cold for years until Stano confessed to the killing in shocking detail, describing the girl's outfit, the location of her remains, and the belt he used to strangle her. The information had never been made public. It was enough for a jury to find him guilty and sentence him to death. But Kathy's case was just one of dozens. With each confession, Stano added another name to a growing list of possible victims. Some families welcomed the closure, even if it came from the mouth of a man as twisted as Gerald. Others were reluctant to accept his story. Still others were left in painful limbo, able to prove or disprove that Stano had anything to do with their loved one's disappearance. The problem wasn't just the confessions, it was the way they were handled. Investigations in the early 1980s weren't equipped with the forensics we have today. DNA analysis was in its infancy. National databases were inconsistent or non-existent. Many cold cases lacked proper documentation, and jurisdictional cooperation between states was rare. In that environment, a man like Stano could confess to a crime, and if the details were even loosely close, he might be believed. Prosecutors faced a dilemma. They needed to prioritize. Pursuing all 40-plus alleged murders would take decades and cost millions. Instead, they focused on the handful of cases with the strongest corroborating evidence. Stano was ultimately convicted of 9 murders in Florida, with several other confessions remaining uncharged. Some hailed the convictions as long overdue justice. Others worried about the precedent it set relying on confessions without concrete physical evidence. The most vocal critics pointed out that Stano had confessed under questionable circumstances. Many of his interviews were not fully recorded. Some were conducted without legal counsel present, and while some detectives insisted that Gerald had never been coerced, others wondered if the pressure to solve high-profile cases had clouded judgment. His defense attorneys leaned hard into this narrative. They portrayed Stano as a man with severe mental illness, a compulsive liar who sought fame and attention. According to their psychiatric evaluations, Stano suffered from antisocial personality disorder and likely had delusional tendencies. They argued that he wanted to be known as a serial killer not because he was one, but because he wanted to matter. In their view, Gerald Stano was confessing to murders he didn't commit because, in his mind, even infamy was better than being forgotten. But the prosecution had its own experts, criminologists and behavioral analysts who pointed out that many of his statements contained specific, unreported details only the killer could have known. They saw Stano not as a confused man, but as a methodical predator, one who had carefully constructed a life of lies and violence. In court, Gerald was calm, even detached. He rarely showed emotion and barely reacted when victims' families testified. His demeanor remained the same, quiet, soft-spoken, sometimes even apologetic. But those who sat in the courtroom described the atmosphere as chilling. One juror said, "It wasn't what he said, it was how casually he said it, like telling someone about a bad dream." Over time, his image became more complex. He wasn't the typical serial killer archetype. He lacked the charisma of a Ted Bundy or the dramatic flair of a John Wayne Gacy. He didn't write taunting letters to the police. He didn't seek the spotlight. Yet, in his own quiet way, he commanded attention. His story dominated headlines across the country, and television crews lined up outside the courtroom every time he appeared. Inside Florida State Prison, Gerald began to fade from public view. He gave a few interviews, each time offering new versions of events. Some investigators continued to visit him, hoping for information about still unsolved cases. He cooperated when he wanted to, then shut down without warning. Over the years, he went from being a notorious name in crime circles to an enigma man who might have been one of the most prolific murderers in U.S. history, or might have been an elaborate fraud. For the families of the victims, the ambiguity was agonizing. Some found peace in knowing he had been sentenced. Others couldn't shake the feeling that justice had been distorted, either by accepting a lie or by failing to uncover the full truth. For every conviction, there were 2 or 3 families left wondering, was it really him? Did he do it? Would we ever know? As appeals came and went, Gerald's execution date crept closer. He rarely spoke of remorse. He did not offer apologies or seek forgiveness. To those who monitored his behavior, he seemed eerily at peace, as if the stories he had told had already etched him into history. Whether they were true or not, justice had been served, at least on paper, but it came with shadows long, lingering, and hard to escape. The truth about Gerald Stano might never be fully known, but the consequences of his confessions, real or imagined, would ripple through dozens of families for decades. On March 23, 1998, at precisely 1:04 a.m., Gerald Eugene Stano was declared dead. The sentence had finally been carried out, death by electric chair at Florida State Prison. It was the end of a case that had confounded investigators, haunted families, and ignited a decades-long debate over truth, justice, and the reliability of confession. But even as the current surged through his body and the official cause of death was recorded, the larger mystery surrounding Gerald Stano remained unsolved. Had justice truly been done? Or had the world just silenced a man who might have been lying all along? In the hours leading up to his execution, Stano remained calm. He did not request a special meal. He did not make a final statement. He refused to meet with reporters or grant any last-minute interviews. For a man who once seemed eager to tell his story, to weave himself into the legacy of America's most notorious killers, he went to his death quietly, without fanfare, without remorse, without confession. There was no apology offered to the families of the victims, no attempt at reconciliation or redemption, just silence. The same kind of silence that had followed many of the women he claimed to have killed, vanished without answers, without closure, their memories left suspended in uncertainty. For those who had followed the case, Stano's silence was both fitting and infuriating. Throughout his life, he had manipulated words like weapons. He confessed, retracted, revised, and reinvented. His interviews were filled with cold recollections and disturbing details, many of which had never been made public, lending credibility to his stories. And yet, other confessions were riddled with holes, inconsistencies, or outright lies. Even in death, Gerald Stano's legacy was fractured. His legal team had spent years filing appeals, arguing that his mental illness and the alleged coercion by detectives during interrogations should have voided his death sentence. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence in many cases and the reliance on his confessions, some given under dubious circumstances, but those appeals ultimately failed. The courts upheld his conviction and sentence, citing the credibility of his knowledge in certain murders and the pattern of disturbing behavior throughout his life. For the families of confirmed victims like Kathy Lee Scharf, the execution marked the end of a long, painful chapter. Kathy had been just 17 when her life was violently taken. Her parents had sat through the trial, listened to the forensic evidence, and watched as their daughter's killer showed no emotion. For them, the death penalty was not just a punishment, it was closure. But for dozens of other families, there would be no such peace. Stano had confessed to more murders than he was ever charged with. Some of those women's remains were never found. Others were buried without names, their deaths still listed as unsolved. Their loved ones were left with only his words, verified, unprovable, and now, forever unchallengeable. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement continued to review cold cases in the years after Stano's execution. Some investigators still believed he had killed far more women than he was ever held accountable for. Others quietly questioned whether he had exaggerated his crimes to elevate himself, to gain notoriety, to control the narrative. After all, many of his confessions had come while he was already incarcerated. There was little to gain except attention. That attention, ironically, was short. Unlike other serial killers who remain embedded in the public imagination, Gerald Stano faded into relative obscurity. He was not charismatic like Ted Bundy. He was not theatrical like Charles Manson. He didn't leave behind journals, manifestos, or puzzles. His story was more complicated, blurred by contradictions, and shaped by a justice system that couldn't fully prove or disprove his words. And yet, for all his ambiguity, Stano did leave something behind: doubt. He exposed the limitations of confession-based prosecutions. He raised questions about how we determine guilt, how we define closure, and how many unsolved cases remain unresolved, not because of a lack of evidence but because the truth itself is slippery, incomplete, and often buried. In the years that followed, some law enforcement agencies revisited their interrogation protocols. Legal scholars pointed to the Stano case as a cautionary tale, warning against the dangers of false or uncorroborated confessions. Meanwhile, several journalists and documentarians tried to uncover the full truth about his life and crimes. Some believed he was a victim of overzealous policing. Others saw him as a manipulative killer who got exactly what he deserved. Gerald Stano's name rarely appears in modern lists of infamous serial killers. But that may be because his story doesn't fit cleanly into any box. He wasn't a textbook monster, nor a clear-cut example of wrongful conviction. He was something in between, a man who lived in the gray areas of fact and fiction, justice and deceit, murder and myth. In the end, he took the answers with him. The electric chair may have silenced Gerald Stano, but the questions he left behind continue to echo through the cold corridors of unsolved murder cases and unfinished investigations. For every family that found closure, another was left with a cruel uncertainty. Was he their daughter's killer, or had they been misled by a man who built his identity on the pain of others? We may never know.